Pushkin. Welcome back to Risky Business, a show about making better decisions. I'm Maria Konnikova.
And I'm Nate Silver. Today on the show, we'll talk about former President Donald Trump, who was convicted last week on 34 felony charges.
And we're also going to be talking about an update from the first week of the World Series. I'm going to go into some of the psychological mistakes I've seen people make, but we're also going to give a big shout out to Nate, who is deep in an event of his own, 15th out of over 2,500 players who started this event.
And this week, Thursday night, if you listen to this on Thursday, the NBA Finals begin. The Boston Celtics are at home against the Dallas Mavericks. There's a big gap between betting markets and statistical models. We will discuss why.
So, Nate, before we get into the Trump verdict, I want to talk about I just want to nod to the fact that you're even here this morning. So at like 4:30 a.m., so I'm back on the East Coast right now, taping this from New Haven. So I get a text because, as it turns out, I forgot to turn off my phone. So that was good.
Sorry, Marie.
It's okay. It's okay. Then I turned it off after that. From Nate saying, just bagged for the day in the 1500 six max. I am number 15 of like 300 and something left in chips. I'll still make the recording. And this is 10 a.m. my time. So Eastern time, it's 7 a.m. Vegas time. And Nate is here. And let the record show, Risky Business listeners, Nate is a much more devoted host than I am, because damned if I would be recording after bagging at 2 a.m. 5 hours later. I would have sent a text to everyone being like, guys, we're really, really sorry. We can't record today. I am 15th in chips, and right now recording is negative EV for me. So anyway, Nate, thank you for being here. Let's get into Trump. So
we'll talk about that, but look, I mean, it happens. We're going to talk on this episode about kind of real life intruding into best laid plans, right?
Yes.
Because we'd be hypocrites if we didn't.
Absolutely.
And by the way, I don't want to make this Trump thing about us or me also, but this is another thing that, like, I did not plan on Trump getting convicted of all these felony charges while I was out at the World Series, and that also kind of blew up a day. But we'll talk about Trump first on his own terms, and then in the poker segment get more into planning versus reality.
So let's do that. So as our listeners probably know, last week, former President Donald Trump was convicted guilty on all 34 charges that he was up on in New York. So Nate, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what that means. And actually, let's start with the fact that you said that you did not expect this to happen while you were at the World Series. Is that because you thought that the verdict would be later, or because you did not expect him to be convicted on all of the 34 charges?
Maria, I think you would probably have a better term for this than I would. It's a cognitive load kind of thing. To some extent, I think people who are able to navigate multiple tasks are able to kind of shut things out and say, I'm going to ignore this for now, right? At some point, I understand that, like, Trump is before this jury, and if you'd actually, like, looked at prediction markets, I'll talk about that on the show from time to time, they had expected a verdict last week, and in fact expected a guilty verdict more likely than not. But no, this is not like to kind of the smart, sharp traders. This is not an unexpected outcome. Trump had not been, I didn't watch the trial, I want to be clear about that. But by the conventional wisdom of people who watched it more closely, Trump had not offered very much compelling argumentation. He had fallen asleep at various points during the trial. I think he's a little bit defiant, obviously, about seeing it as an opportunity for like a campaign exercise, spin exercise, and I assume he thinks he won't go to actual jail at any point, although there's some chance in theory that he could. We are not legal analysts. I don't know if we're going to offer much opinion about, like, is this the right case, quote unquote, to bring against Trump. I'm here to analyze public opinion a little bit more and our guesses about what effect this might have on the polls. Most members of the public, if they were aware of the trial at all, did not expect a guilty verdict. I think because Trump has kind of skated by so often with with relatively few consequences, did become president after all for 4 years and may become president again for another 4 years, expected there not to be consequences for his actions. So that's one reason why you might expect it to affect the polls, is because it comes as a surprise to rank and file voters.
But isn't it true, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that New York is the only state where he has actually faced consequences because he did have to pay for, the hush money payments he and the defamation earlier,
which is a separate case, right?
Right,
I mean, there's
right.
the Jean Carroll sexual assault case. So yeah, New York is kind of and I don't know how much you want to get into the. I mean, this was considered, of the 4 criminal cases, which is separate, by the way, from the defamation case, which is a civil case.
Right. And this one was considered the weakest, is kind of the background that I had seen.
Correct. I mean, the way Republicans would convey it is it's kind of like Al Capone being convicted on income tax fraud instead of all the other stuff that Al Capone.
The guy was convicted. It didn't matter that it was on income tax fraud.
Look, let me, you want to get into this a little bit? I am worried a little bit because the argument that worries me a bit is that in authoritarian countries, oftentimes if there is a opposition leader, who you want to disenfranchise, then you trump up some legal charges that may range from technically correct but exaggerated to entirely fabricated. Alvin Bragg, the prosecutor, had talked about, kind of campaigned on being tougher on Trump, right? It's in Manhattan, a place where something like 85-90% of the voters, the jury pool, voted for Biden. Although, to be fair, some of them consumed media from sites like Truth Social, Trump's alternative to Twitter/X. But look, the fact that Trump has been prosecuted and criticized and persecuted, that may feed into his appeal for a certain strain of voter. However, given that reality, which you cannot undo for better or worse at this point, I think Biden is much better off with a guilty verdict than an acquittal, right? Because you can't take back the fact that there are all these charges. You can't take back the fact that, to me, the election overturning January 6th stuff is a couple of orders of magnitude, meaning literally hundreds of times more serious than anything involving a former porn actress.
Sure.
But, again, plans don't always kind of match the ideal reality. I think the more buttoned up prosecutions in the January 6th trials have taken a long time. But anyway, Trump has been convicted on this first set of charges. He will almost for sure appeal, I would think. The sentencing phase will still occur in July, just before the Republican National Convention. But that's where we stand.
Yeah. And obviously I'm not an expert in the polling part of this. And so I'm curious because, I've been reading the news, like I'm a good news consumer. I've been following the trial. I'm still a little bit bummed that it wasn't televised, but it wasn't. So I was following from afar, and I have read kind of takes on both sides that, as you said, given that this happened and that we can't control the timing, it's great that at least the verdict was guilty. However, I have also seen kind of the other side that this just strengthens Trump's position among a huge kind of swath of Trump voters, and that a lot of people see this as kind of part of his brand, right? This is the guy who said, I can stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and still be elected. And here he is saying, see, I don't follow your laws. Like I'm a renegade. I'm my own man. And they're like, and this just shows that, the judicial system is corrupt. So I guess there are two separate questions here. One, do you have a sense now, or is it a little bit too early to figure out how this is going to go down kind of in the polls in the Trump base? And two, and this is a kind of a separate question, let's talk a little bit afterwards about the judicial impact of this and kind of the delegitimization of the judicial system that Trump is trying to push as a story.
So as gamblers or poker players, we think in terms of the marginal effect on something, right? If you beamed to 2024 from 10 years ago, you'd be shocked by a lot of things. You'd be shocked that, that Donald Trump had become president. You'd be shocked, B, that Trump was running for president again, and in fact was tied or ahead in the polls despite his various criminal charges and how kind of his first term ended with January 6th and with COVID. You'd be surprised that the trial wasn't in some sense a bigger deal. I mean, people have been pretty tuned out to this until the verdict occurred, including even people like me, I guess, in the news business to some extent. However, people in our world, Maria, the poker kind of gambling world, think in terms of what's priced in, quote unquote, to the stock.
Yeah.
So if you look at betting markets, a week ago, which was just before when we're taping this, it's Tuesday morning, Vegas time. In prediction markets, Trump had a 53% chance of winning the election before the verdict. Now that is 51%. So he has fallen by 2 percentage points relative to where he was pre-verdict. And by the way, because people assumed before that he was more likely than not to be guilty, if this had come totally out of the blue, it might have been a bigger shift. But basically, like, people putting money on the line follow the conventional wisdom that I outlined earlier, which is that, you know, being a convicted felon is probably bad, right? I mean, this is kind of where we are
Probably.
in politics now. It's certainly worse for Trump than being an acquitted, accused felon who even in New York could have been found guilty. I mean, imagine that, right? That would have been, I think, a big feather in Trump's cap and a big disaster for Biden. Now, with that said, for the most part now, people are making educated guesses about the impact. There is some kind of instant turnaround polling. Some of that shows Biden gaining a point or two net. There's actually one poll from Morning Consult that has Biden actually losing a point or so. But we don't have a high quality traditional pollster going and doing a proper sample with a proper amount of time and asking the right questions to a demographically balanced sample, because that just takes a little bit of time. And the pollsters apparently didn't necessarily plan in advance for this verdict occurring either.
They're probably at the World Series of Poker with you, Nate.
You never know, Maria. I mean, you never know who you'll see at the World Series. However, this is important because Trump raised $141 million in May, bolstered in part by this guilty verdict. He had a massive amount of 48-hour fundraising. I think money's a little bit overrated in presidential campaigns, but the point is, yeah, his base is really enthused. And by the way, Biden's base is really enthused too. They're tweeting lots of memes about, you know, Donald Trump in a prison jumpsuit and things like that.
Very mature.
Both the bases
very mature
are
political process.
I wouldn't have dared to even watch MSNBC, what would have happened on Thursday and Friday and all of that, right? To me, though, these are not the voters who matter because their votes are already locked in. Instead, it's the kind of casual, normie voter who says, no matter what else, Donald Trump is a convicted felon. And even the New York Post, for example, which I use the New York Post as like a benchmark of conservative but not totally red-pilled Fox News opinion. They're trying to, in a competitive news market, they're trying to, you know, they like the actual news. And the New York Post had like the banner headline about Trump being guilty. They weren't trying to spin it too much. So everybody saw this headline about Trump is guilty of 36 or 34. Am I inflating
34,
it now?
34, yeah.
Trump is guilty of 34 felony charges.
But, you know,
not
inflation's
34
real,
felonies.
Nate. Inflation's real.
Another problem for Biden. But like part of it is, what are the basic, simple, stylized facts about the election? You know, for Biden, the fact is that prices are a lot higher than they were 4 years ago. Now you can debate that and say, well, most of that happened in 2021 and 2022, and inflation has slowed down now. And by the way, you've had inflation all around the world, and it's kind of maybe not entirely Biden's fault. And the jobs market is good. But in politics, when you're explaining you're losing is the axiom. It's similarly like when the fact that Biden is 81 years old, and I think often looks and acts like it, is a simple fact. By the way, Trump is 77, will turn 78 before too much longer. You know, that fact is very hard for Biden to overcome. You can spin and say, well, Trump is almost as old, and Biden is, you know, managing the toughest job in the world and whatever else. We have better healthcare. But like, the more explaining you're doing, you're losing it. In this case, it's Trump and his team on their heels, right? They're the ones who are saying this prosecution is unfair, and how can you expect a jury verdict in New York to be fair, and blah, 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 right?
Yeah. And I'd love to just pause and just go more deeply onto that point, because I think that elections aside, right, since we don't have the poll numbers yet, and we probably won't when this podcast comes out in a few days, but what we are already seeing is kind of what I'd alluded to before, the arguments that Trump has been making for quite some time about the fact that you can't trust our judicial system, right? The judicial system is corrupt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he's been making this argument at every single level of government. And I think that that's kind of a long-term consequence that might actually kind of last longer than this particular election, this particular trial, because what he's doing is undermining kind of one of the pillars of democracy and the system that traditionally the American public has had the most trust in. And now we see that trust eroding because Trump keeps repeating over and over and over these statements, which are blatant lies. But as a psychologist, I can say that it doesn't matter, because the more someone repeats a lie, it starts feeling like the truth.
Yeah, look, trust in almost every major American institution. To some extent, the military is an exception. But almost every major American institution has declined over the past 10, 20, 30 years. How much Trump is a cause of that versus a symptom is a debate, I'm sure, that academics and historians will have for a long time. I mean, Trump takes advantage of low trust voters. We're in a downward trust spiral in the US. Trump is a major kind of cog in that machine, but not the only cog. I mean, I don't know. Maria, on the show, I want to be able to express ambiguous or ambivalent opinions. Yeah. I have ambivalent feelings about the prosecution by Alvin Bragg. If I spent 100 more hours looking at it, I might have stronger feelings one way or the other. But, I do think it's probably right. I think if you kind of surveyed most nonpartisan legal experts, they would say that, like, to turn these into felony charges is not unheard of, but is unusual. And in a statistical sense, you would infer that Trump's status as a former president kind of is part of that. But, it's not great for the country that you have a active presidential candidate who's 50-50 to become president again, and that it took so long to bring these charges to trial, that the ones that do go to trial are, I think, by anyone's definition, the weakest charges. In the more kind of partisan jurisdiction, it's not ideal.
No, it's not. So, Nate, if I'm going to go back through this and try to metabolize all of it, what are the key, let's say, 2 things I should take away from this analysis, from our conversation?
Look, I'd say number 1, pay more attention to the marginal voter, not the cable news pundit, but the marginal voter who is not paying attention to every detail in the race for the White House, but who sees big banner headlines, Trump convicted, Trump guilty. Number 2, be patient as you wait for the polls, because these marginal voters are harder to reach. The quick and dirty polls may not reach them yet, so we're going on limited information. And number 3, I think, separate out the question of, is this good or bad for the country, from, is this good or bad for Joe Biden and Donald Trump, right? I mean, those are different questions. We've tried to mainly focus on the electoral impact here, and not pretend that we're legal scholars.
Nate, I am so excited for you. Week 1 of the World Series has wrapped. I unfortunately have left Las Vegas, so I haven't been able to play after the first 2 events because I have some other commitments. I'll be back next week. But you, while I've been traveling the world to glamorous New Haven, you've been running up quite the chip stack in the $1,500 six max event, which is incredibly exciting. So you are in the money. So for people who don't play poker, that means that Nate has already cashed. So every single player eliminated from this point on is going to be making money. You are about to start day 2 of the tournament. So you found your first bag of the series, which means you bagged up chips. There are over 300 players left. I don't remember how many. I looked this up before we started taping, but I don't remember. It's like 330, something like that. Does that sound right to you?
It's like
And
those counts are delayed. It's like actually,
all right.
so 2,500 started, of which about, I think 190 remain.
Ah,
And I'm in 15th place out of
so
the,
yeah, so Nate,
yeah.
you are in 15th place, and we're going to talk about the three biggest mistakes I've been seeing at the tables in the week that I played. But it seems like before we get into that, it seems like you have probably not been making these mistakes because you
Oh,
are
no,
now
yeah.
15th in chips. So just first of all, congratulations. So
Well,
say
look,
thank you. No, say thank you.
we are able to, thank you, Maria.
Okay, now,
But like, I won't
now
feel that
all
good
of the
if like,
caveats.
okay. This is fun because we can put this episode in a little bit of a time capsule. Again, in the realities of the highly produced podcast world, we are taping this on early Tuesday morning, Vegas time. It will come out in your feeds on Thursday. By the time you listen to this, the tournament that I'm playing right now will be over. I could have won my first bracelet. Much more likely statistically, I will be knocked out at some point, just after lunch today, and then be disappointed
Nate, that's
about some
optimistic.
bad.
Just after lunch, you're lasting through lunch. That's great.
I mean, look, I do have a lot of chips.
It's true.
I have a lot of chips. I have a lot of short stacks at my table. But like, one thing I like to do if I make a day 2 or day 3 is to situate myself in terms of rational expectations, right? In this tournament last year, only 10% of the field who made day 2 made the final day 3. Now, I have a well above average chip stack, but even knowing that, I know that 75-ish% of the time, if I'm being realistic, my day will end with busting out of this tournament and deciding whether to enter a different tournament instead. So I think always kind of situating yourself and understanding that you can have a great day 1 and the odds are still against you. It's very, very hard, Maria, to win a tournament or make a final table when there are 2,500 people. You need to kind of keep rolling the dice and having it coming up sixes like 3 times in a row, or maybe more than that, right? Like 4 times in a row, right? It's pretty hard for that to happen. And having the first 6 and the second 6 come up sixes is just kind of the first, halfway through the marathon, so to speak.
Well, I think that that's a very healthy attitude. I think too many people get very excited about having lots of chips. That said, having lots of chips is better than not having lots of chips. And from what I know about your playing style, you're an aggressive player who knows how to push that advantage, which I think is really important. And I think you have a very good attitude coming into this. So now let's, have a positive mindset and say that this is going to be your first bracelet, or at least a final table. And I say that completely selflessly because we have no swap in this event because I have not played it. So this is all you. And I wish you the best. And let me give you some advice for the 3 top things not to do that I've seen.
Yeah. What have you been seeing that players shouldn't be doing?
All right. So I've been seeing a lot of things that players shouldn't be doing. So I played, I played 2 World Series events this past week, and then I played a Win event, so the Win 1100 event as well. So I've seen a few different player pools, and this is me generalizing from everything that I've been seeing. What are the 3 most common mistakes? By far, number 1 that I have seen is what's known in psychology as the sunk cost fallacy. And what the sunk cost fallacy means is that you make a decision, and then when the decision environment changes, when the information changes, when the data change, and your decision no longer makes sense, instead of walking away, instead of saying, okay, I made the right decision before, it's no longer the right decision, you stick with it. You put good money after bad, good time after bad. You stay in that decision because you say, well, I've already invested so much. In poker, there's a concept known as pot committed, meaning I've already put so many chips in the middle that I am committed to the pot. And I think that that is actually one of the stupidest concepts in poker. I mean, I just think it's asinine, like so dumb. I can't even begin to say, because decisions are not made in a vacuum. It does not matter how many chips you put in one move ago, pre-flop or on the flop. As long as you have chips left, if you now know that you're beat, right? If you now know that the decision environment has changed, fold, walk away. keep the chips that you have. It's a huge lesson for life, by the way, being able to walk away and realize I still have something left and I should be able to use that. I think that's a really important life skill. One of the most important that I've learned from poker is kind of that. And let me tell you a specific hand where I saw this play out that I think is kind of illustrative of this idea. So in this hand, I think we're playing 8-handed, and I raise from under the gun. So I'm first to act, and I have pocket kings. So I raise, and then another player 3-bets me. So he re-raises from the button. So that's, very strong position, obviously. He'll always be last to act. The button is your best position. I don't love, playing huge pots out of position. So I 4-bet, which means I then re-raise him. At this point, the only hand I lose to is aces. And I'm not particularly, you can't see monsters under the bed. So I re-raise and he calls and we go to the flop. So it's just the two of us. And the flop comes queen high and it's all hearts. I think it's 6-8 queen, all hearts. I do not have the king of hearts. I check and he bets. And I call. Even though, at this point I could be drawing dead, right? He could have ace king of hearts, right? He could have ace jack of hearts. He could already have flopped the nuts. And he bets pretty big. But I can't fold to 1-bet. And then the turn is an offsuit king. So at this point, I now have top set. And so I check and he bets again, but he bets really small, right? So he now bets like a quarter pot. And I was like, okay, you do not have a flush, right? At this point, it really just looked like he just did not like that king at all. And so I raise because, that seems like the appropriate thing to do. And he does not have that many chips left behind. And you can just see him just completely pained and then just like shakes his head and like puts all his chips in the middle. And he turns over pocket queens and he's like, oh, I knew I was beat. I was like, well, if don't say that, right? If you're beat, just fold. He still had a lot of chips behind, but he just couldn't let it go. He had flopped, top set. He knew that he was kind of ahead of me and even though the world changed on the turn, he just couldn't acknowledge it and he couldn't walk away. And I've seen that so many times.
I mean, look, in his defense, he could think that you have a flush and he has some outs to draw to a full house. But yeah, poker players stick their chips in almost as a form of self-punishment sometimes.
Yeah,
I'm a fish.
It's a great way
I play this hand badly. And by the way, one thing, as you were speaking, Maria, obviously, if there's new information, I think also people need to give themselves permission to rethink things, right?
Absolutely.
To say, maybe there's not new information, but I have had time to think about this more, and I just don't think it's plausible that my opponent is bluffing very often here. I had time while the dealer was dealing the cards to think about, like, what bluffs would Maria have in her range? And, like, in this spot, it's hard on these flush boards with the king coming. Making a life choice belatedly that's a positive life choice is still better than saying it's a sunk cost. I can't make any change at all. Okay, Maria, let's go into your tip or mistake.
Yeah.
Tips for last week. This week's about mistakes. We're in the messy real world now. What's mistake number 2 you've been seeing at the table?
Yeah, so mistake number 2 is actually probably one of the most famous biases in psychology. And so it's always so fun to me as a psychologist to see the things that, that theoretically should be very strong, see them actually in reality play out this way. And that's risk aversion. So this is part of Danny Kahneman's and Amos Tversky's famous prospect theory, right? Where losses and gains are looked at differently. And depending on how you frame losses, depending on how you frame gains, people will be more or less risk averse. And so what I have seen is that people have been too risk averse at stages of the tournament where they should be taking risks because they value kind of their tournament life too much and they don't understand how tournament poker works. So as an example, I saw a hand, I was not in this hand, where someone raised, someone re-raised, and then this person ended up folding ace king face up, ace king suited, having like 30 big blinds left, saying, it's too early. It's too early for me to flip. Yeah. And it was just such a bad mistake, right? When I saw that, I was like, what do you mean it's too early to flip? You have 30 big blinds. That's not that, you should be flipping. You have to take those spots. If you're valuing your tournament life, you're valuing not busting so incredibly highly, that means that either you're playing too high, you're in the wrong spot, because that's not the rational decision to make. The flip side of this, at EPT Paris back in February, which was won by Barney Boatman, who's kind of an old school legend, there was a really great televised hand where they were at the final table, or the final two tables, and someone ran kind of a big bluff against him, putting him to the test, right? Barney had to call off all of his chips, and it was a really hard call. Barney finally made it. And when his opponent kind of turned over the cards, saw what Barney had called with, he said, "How could you call for your tournament life here? Like, you can't do that." And Barney looks at him and says, "It's my tournament life, not my actual life." It's like, that's just such a great line, because that's how you have to, right? It's fine to be too risk averse when it's your actual life. It's when you're playing in a tournament, you have to make those calculated risks. You have to take those flips. You have to take those spots. Otherwise, you ain't ever winning a tournament.
Maria, I got news for you. Now that we're into the second week of the World Series of Poker, that virginal risk aversion bubble has popped little bit. In the 1500 yesterday, all my chips, or 95% of them, are from making hands and extracting value. The bluffs were not working. I lost money on my bluffs yesterday, and I'm someone who, people, believe it or not, actually like to fold to sometimes. People were getting a little bit rambunctious. I think you kind of get into this point in the tournament where maybe you have fired 4 or 5 or 6 entries. People are getting, though, a little bit friskier, I think, with kind of a lot of these smaller events, and the Mystery Millions is a tournament where you can enter like literally 8 times if you want. This is the first event. After that, so you have people who are a little bit on tilt from, literally as we're playing, by the way, people are drawing prizes from this bounty pool, winning $1 million or $250,000, right? And here you are plodding along in your $1,500 tournament. That was encouraging, I think, a lot more risk taking. So This is self-corrects a little bit. But I agree in general that as a default, even in the poker world, as a default, people are usually too risk averse. For the Barney Boatman reason that it's just a fucking poker tournament, right? I understand that you make day 2, day 3, the money can be significant. It's just a fucking poker tournament.
That's very true.
If you were putting your life on your line to enter the tournament, then you made a bad decision in the first place. So I can't really guide you, but this is kind of a laboratory where you can repeat the experiment and enter a different tournament, especially the World Series. And so don't be a nit is one of our favorite things to say. A nit means a neurotic, risk-averse, turd in the punch bowl, basically, Maria.
Absolutely. So that's, that's number 2, but I'm glad that you're saying that it's been self-correcting, because that actually goes to mistake number 3 that I've been seeing, which is people becoming too emotional and making decisions based on how they're feeling and what just happened, as opposed to based on data and based on kind of what they should be using in their logical, rational decision making. So they're going on tilt and basically making just really egregious errors. So once again, I think it's always good to have an example. I was playing, this was, I think, it might have even been during the $5,000 event. No, it was the $500 event. So the second event, slightly smaller event. It was a freeze out, which is important, which means people can't rebuy. This is not the mystery bounty. And I had a gentleman to my left who'd been, playing fairly well. I didn't know him, but I think he played a lot of poker. And then he got into a spot against someone else where he was, on the river and facing a huge bet. And he needed to decide whether or not he was going to call. And he just tanked. And it's a pretty turbo structure, right? The levels are 30 minutes long.
Meaning that your chip count dwindles in absolute terms very quickly.
So you need to act quickly. So here's this guy, and he's been thinking for 2 minutes. So I think nicely, and the table agreed, said, I know you're in a tough spot, but just so you know, I'm going to call the clock in 1 minute, because, taking 2 minutes, if you think about it, I said I was going to call it at 3 minutes, right?
Oh,
which is 10%,
you're much nicer than I,
which is 10% of the time. And I gave him that warning. And then he just puts in the call, and it's the wrong call, and he loses the pot. And then he turns to me and he says, well, it's only a turbo if you're used to playing bullshit live events. This is not a turbo structure. I was like, well, empirically it is. Anyway, very next hand, I'm on the button and he's in the small blind. And I raise, and he just looks at me and he goes, well, I'm all in. And he just shoves and rips it. And then the big blind folds. And I have ace six of spades, which is a good hand, but not a great hand. But given what just happened, I was like, I'm going to call. So I did. He had queen five offsuit. Luckily he didn't hit, and I knocked him out. Don't be that guy. It does not matter if you just made a bad decision. Do not make another bad decision because of that. If someone calls the clock on you, I didn't even call the clock on him, right? Like, just do not be that guy. Make rational decisions. Do not punt with queen five offsuit, even though you still have a ton of chips, just because you're pissed off and you think that, that someone's picking on you.
I think the guy thing, like, not to be too like woke here or anything, the guy thing is important though, because like, men with other men don't want to lose face, and that can like manifest itself in different ways. But like, I haven't been quite in that spot as often as people seem to react to you that way, even though I would have been probably more aggressive about just calling the clock and not giving him like a warning. I do think that like, men who feel like they're embarrassed by women, I mean, this is not like some deep breakthrough here, right? But like, men who feel like they're embarrassed by women can kind of go on tilt in different ways than they might if they're embarrassed by another guy.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And I actually wrote an entire piece about sexism in poker on my Substack this week. And a guy also going on tilt to a female gave me a $10,000 main event seat. So I'm very grateful for that. So everyone, do not make this mistake unless you're a bounty with $10,000 on your head, in which case, please do emotionally tilt and give me your chips. But Nate, I think that is a great place to wrap it up and to say again, I trust that you will not make any of these mistakes today. I hope you play well, and may the cards be with you, because that's the one thing that you can't control. So Nate, Risky Business is still a young show. We're a month old, and I have already learned more about basketball than I have learned during my entire life. And here we are doing yet another basketball segment. Last week, when I told you that I was ready to go to a Knicks game, you informed me that unfortunately they were already out. So that wasn't great timing. So we'll have to go next season. But you've also informed me, and I didn't know, that we're now starting the NBA Finals, which sounds really, really exciting. And I'm gonna get some real excitement going once I finally go to an NBA game. I'm sure you will teach me to love it. But for now, let me ask you, who's playing in the finals, and why do we care?
Maria, are you anti-sports? Are you one of the University of the New Yorker? Are you one of those people who call it sports ball and things like that? I'm. By the way, your hometown team, the Boston Celtics, is one of the two teams involved in the NBA Finals.
Celtics. That's exciting. I didn't know. The
other team is the Dallas Mavericks, who are, I guess I was going to say younger. They're not that young, but they kind of overachieved expectations this year. I did a kind of preseason preview for my newsletter subscribers at Silver Bulletin, talked about every team, although I was very bullish in the Celtics. I was skeptical the Dallas Mavericks would even make the playoffs. Oh, wow. And here they are in the NBA Finals. So what the fuck do I know, I suppose?
See, so I didn't know who'd be in the finals, and Nate, you didn't know who'd be in the finals either. For
different reasons, I would say, but the point is well taken.
But no, for the record, let the record show I am not anti-sport, and I'm very excited about getting excited about sports once I know more about them.
Anti-sport? Are you British? They call it like sport singular instead of plural.
I said anti-sports.
The sport pages.
All right, sorry. Fine. My fake English accent friend. I am not anti-athletics. Sports teams.
Okay, you're not helping yourself here, I don't think. Here's what I want to discuss, though, and we'll be short with this segment. There is a gap here between kind of what the stats would say and what the betting markets say. So the Celtics in the regular season went 64 and 18. Winning 64 games is a very, very, very good record. Dallas, by contrast, went 50, 5-0, and 32.
Okay.
They were a number 5 seed. The Celtics were a number 1 seed. The Celtics are 12 and 2 so far in the playoffs. They have virtually swept every series. The Celtics have an average victory margin of more than 10.8 points per game, or more than 10 points per game, which is one of the best in NBA history this year. So if you look at a system like, I'm going to promote a system called EPM, which is by at the site Dunks and Threes. It's a good, very good basketball analysis site that rates individual players and has team projections. Their projections have the Celtics with an 86% chance, 86% of the Celtics, who, by the way, have a home court, and Boston's a good home court advantage, an 86% chance of winning the finals. Now, if I go downstairs...
That seems like a pretty high chance.
It's a pretty high chance, but the NBA is a game where... a game of dominance.
Okay.
Compare, for example, a basketball game to a football game. In the NBA, each team has over 100 possessions, maybe even 110 or 120, given how fast-paced the game is nowadays, right? In the NFL, a team might have, 12 or 13 possessions in a game, so roughly 1/10 as much. If you roll a dice 110 times versus 12 times, and you match the kind of long-run statistical distribution much more closely with a larger sample size. So in the NBA, small edges shooting 39% from three-point range instead of 36%, that plays out when you're taking all these shots per game, so that the better team usually wins in the NBA like almost no other sport, right? Michael Jordan's Bulls, when he was on the team, won 6 championships. The Warriors won whatever it was, 3 and 4 years. So again, my favorite basketball stats site, dunksandthrees.com, gives Boston an 86.4% chance of winning. If I believe that number, I can go down to the sportsbook here, I'm staying at the Cosmo, I guess, or anywhere in Vegas, and make what in theory is a very, very profitable bet. That bet implies they only have to win 70% of the time, 7-0. 86 is a lot higher than 70 to a gambler or a poker player. And yet, Maria, I have not made that bet yet, despite having been in Vegas all week.
So why haven't you made that bet, Nate?
Partly because I should say, full disclosure, I probably will, by the time you listen to this, have made some amount of bets somewhere on the Celtics. But look, a couple reasons why. Number one is that I have repeatedly been low on the Mavericks throughout the season, right? Which may mean that there is just something that I don't understand, and I have to concede that the betting public, which is very sharp in the aggregate, knows something, or not knows something that I don't, but has a better read on the situation. Now look, the NBA Finals is such a big public event that you have a lot of, how should we say, a lot of dumb money on the series sometimes. One belief of that I think maybe is not dumb is that Luka Doncic is a Dallas Maverick superstar. I don't know what you want to call him. He's kind of plays point guard, but kind of like a small forward / unicorn bowling ball in his own way. He is pretty clearly the best player in the series. I think people are now calling him maybe the best player, at least the best offensive player in the NBA. Probably not the best all-around player.
So what you're saying is he's the Caitlin Clark of the team?
Caitlin Clark is off to a little bit of a rocky start here, actually, Maria. I don't think he would be flattered by the Caitlin Clark comparison. No, he is. I'm not sure what the right compare. I mean, he's not super athletic, so I'm not he's the Michael Jordan or LeBron James, because those guys are much better athletes. We get into a little bit of racial profiling. I mean, Larry Bird is not the worst comparable for Luka necessarily, where he shoots, he rebounds. Larry Bird was a better defensive player than Luka, most likely, but Luka's more dominant. He can take over a game. We're talking about dominance here, and in general, when you have the best player in the game, then your team wins. Especially in the finals where everyone's playing maximum minutes, maximum effort. So it's a best player versus best team thing. I think the kind of public believes heavily in the best player. They kind of also think the Celtics are chokers. They've been in the finals before. They've made deep playoff runs that ended badly. That's probably just like, look, I think the reality is probably halfway between the stats and the public, which means I should go and make some type of bet on Boston. Mm-hmm. People may be emotional because Boston has burned them before, but, by the numbers, they are a fantastic basketball team. They're at home. They're very deep. They do have very good players. I mean, Jason Tatum might be the 6th best player in the league. Jaylen Brown might be the, 30th best player. Derek White might be the 28th best player or something, right? They're very deep. And I think, you hear people at the poker tables being like, well, I don't know, the Celtics are chokers. Like, that's actually a reason to bet on the Celtics when, like, generic poker players are, like, who don't know that much about basketball they're the ones who are, like, helping to set the market line. And I think their rationales are not that compelling. But at the same time, I'm not sure I want to bet that much against Luka.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point about how betting works in general, right? You do need to have some sort of idea about where you are relative to the public, but also how much you personally are willing to risk, right? Like, can you risk ruin with these odds or not? And I think usually, especially from what I understand of sports betting, the answer usually is no, please don't, right? that there is uncertainty and emotions do get into it on every single line. And as accurate as a market might be, as accurate as a line might be, there will be kind of emotional betting and shit happens, right? Like, this is a game of individuals. And I think that's kind of the other point you're making. Someone might be having a great day. Somebody might be having an off day. Somebody might be a superstar. Someone might choke. You can't account for all of those variables. And I think that's important in a game like basketball.
So I'm going back to the beautiful Paris Horse Show Casino in just about 2.5 hours. Maria, when are you back in town?
So it is now Tuesday. I will be doing a multi-country tour between now and then. So from New Haven, I'm going back to New York. And from there, I am going to Ireland. And then on Saturday evening, so late on Saturday, I will be back in Las Vegas, ready to play on Sunday. Now, this depends on how well I've slept, how rested I am. But assuming everything goes smoothly and I'm well rested, I'm actually going to be playing my biggest buy-in event of the summer, the $25,000 8-handed event on Sunday.
And meanwhile, I will be away. I'll be in California briefly on Sunday and then back in New York. So we're not doing a very good job of coordinating our schedules, Maria.
No, we're not. But this just means that you and I don't have to compete for bracelets. We can both win bracelets in separate events.
Perfect.
Risky Business is hosted by me, Maria Konnikova.
And me, Nate Silver.
The show is a co-production of Pushkin Industries and iHeartMedia. This episode was produced by Isabel Carter. Our associate producer is Gabriel Hunter Chang. Our executive producer is Jacob Goldstein.
If you like the show, please rate and review us so other people can find us more easily. And if you want to listen to an ad-free version, sign up for Pushkin Plus. For $6.99 a month, you get access to ad-free listening. Thanks for tuning in.